Hey friends, welcome back to Homestead on a Prayer. In case you're new here, my name's Jennifer. We're here in my kitchen today and I have a really exciting video that I am really excited to share with you guys today. Now, not that long ago, we did a video together where we made 5 sheet pan meals, and making that video was so much fun. I really enjoyed it. And so I wanted to make another video kind of along the same lines, but today we are going to be talking about 5 really easy and delicious quick bread recipes. Now, these make great desserts. If you want to be a little bit decadent, you could maybe call these a breakfast, but we really use them for desserts in my house. So I'm really excited to go through all these recipes with you guys. So we are going to be making 3 tried and true favorites that we've made a few times, or in some cases over and over in my family, and we really love them. We're also going to be trying out 2 completely new recipes together, so I'm really excited to see how those turn out. They look really great too. So I'm going to go ahead and link all of these recipes in the video description. So if you're watching this video and you find something you really want to try, that's where you can find the recipe. Today we are going to be making one of my favorites, especially for fall, and that is apple fritter bread. Last week my family went apple picking and we have lots of delicious apples that we're trying to use in all kinds of really exciting and different and of course delicious ways. So just a few prep things before we really get into making our bread. I have preheated my oven to 350 degrees. It's preheating now, so by the time it reaches temperature, our bread will be ready to stick in the oven. Also, I have a 9x5 glass baking dish here, and I have sprayed that with cooking spray, so that's sitting there waiting for us. Just a note on the loaf pan, the recipe does say to line the loaf pan with parchment paper, spray the parchment paper. You can definitely do that. I haven't done that in the past, and I haven't had any issues. But just to give the little caveat that the recipe does say to do that. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to mix together some cinnamon and brown sugar in this little bowl here, and we're going to set this to the side. So we're going to grab 1/3 of a cup. The recipe says light brown sugar. I prefer dark brown, and that's what I always have on hand, so that's what we're going to use in here. To our brown sugar, we are going to add 1 teaspoon of cinnamon, then we're just going to go ahead and mix this up, and we're going to set this to the side. This is going to be the cinnamon sugar layer in the center of our bread. Makes it so good. So definitely do not want to leave out this step. The next thing we're going to do is prep our apples. So we want to get these peeled and chopped up. So to our bowl of chopped apples here, we are going to add 2 tablespoons of granulated sugar and 1 teaspoon of cinnamon. So let's get this all mixed up so all our apples are evenly coated in our cinnamon sugar mixture. So now it's time to make the batter for our bread. I've pulled out my stand mixer here. You could certainly do this by hand if you would prefer, or with a hand mixer. I find it easiest to use a stand mixer, so that's what I am going to use. So I'm going to add in 1/2 cup of softened butter, which is the same as 1 stick of butter. To the butter, I'm going to add 2/3 of a cup of granulated sugar. Then we're just going to mix this up and cream it until the butter and sugar are light and fluffy. Our butter and sugar are all creamed up. Now I want to add 2 eggs. I like to crack my eggs into a separate container ahead of time just because you never know. So we're going to turn the mixer back onto medium. I'm going to add the eggs one at a time while it's running. So our eggs are nicely incorporated. I'm going to add 1½ teaspoons, which is the same as 1/2 tablespoon, of vanilla extract. I have some really nice homemade vanilla extract here that I'm adding. And then we're going to run the mixer again just to incorporate that. We're going to mix up our dry ingredients in this bowl here. I've already added 1½ cups of flour to the bowl. Now we're going to add 1 3/4 teaspoons of baking powder. My baking powder tends to be a little bit clumpy sometimes, so I'm going to sift it through this strainer here. And that's 1 teaspoon. I'm going to fill this most of the way to get about 1 3/4. I'm just going to press the lumps through this strainer to make sure we don't end up with any clumps of baking powder in our final product. Next, we're going to add 1 teaspoon of kosher salt. I have here this Redmond real salt that I really like. So we're going to mix this in. And once we have all our ingredients in this bowl, we're just going to whisk them all up to get them incorporated. Now we're going to gradually incorporate our dry ingredients into our wet ingredients. I like to add this in 2 separate additions just to make sure that it all mixes up evenly. The final ingredient that we need to add to our bread batter is milk, which I am actually out of right now. I do have heavy cream. So what we're going to do, we need 1/2 cup of milk. So we are going to mix together 1/4 cup of heavy cream and 1/4 cup water to thin it out to about the consistency of milk. And for this type of recipe, that will work completely fine. So our batter is all done mixing and it looks beautiful. So we are going to add 1/2 of this batter right into our pan here that we prepared. And I think that's about 1/2. We're not going to be really precise. This batter's a little bit on the thicker side, so I just want to spread it out to make sure it covers the whole bottom of this pan here. Now we're going to grab these apples that we tossed with a little bit of cinnamon and sugar, and we are going to add 1/2 of these to our bread right on top of that batter. Next, we're going to take 1/2 of our brown sugar cinnamon mixture and sprinkle that right on top of the apple layer. You do also, I think I forgot to mention this, when you're adding the apples, you do want to make sure to gently press them into the batter. We don't want a lot of air pockets in there. Now we're just going to repeat those layers. So we're going to add the rest of our batter right on top of the apples and the cinnamon sugar mixture. And I don't think I did this completely evenly. I think I did a little more than 1/2 on the first layer, but this recipe is pretty forgiving when it comes to that kind of thing. So once again, I'm just going to do my best to spread this out. If a little bit of the cinnamon sugar mixture comes up along with it, you know, that's really fine. We just want to make sure that we have a solid second layer of our batter. Just going to top with the rest of the apples. And then the rest of our cinnamon sugar mixture. My hands are clean, so I'm just going to go ahead and do this with my fingers. I find that I'm able to distribute it a little more evenly if I work right with my hands. Now that we have all our layers added, we're just going to take our knife and kind of gently swirl the cinnamon sugar mixture into the apples, just to make sure it's even. This will allow the apples to incorporate into our bread a little bit more too. And I'm just going to kind of pat it down a little bit just to smooth out the top. So our bread is all ready to go into our preheated 350-degree oven. As you can see, it looks beautiful, and that is going to bake up to be so delicious. Now our recipe says to check on this. It says that it's going to bake for about 1 hour and 10 minutes. To start checking on it after 1 hour to make sure that if the top is getting too brown, we can cover it with aluminum foil to prevent too much browning. I always like to err on the side of caution, so we're going to start checking on this at about 50 minutes. When a toothpick can be inserted into the center and come out clean, then you know it's done. So I'm going to meet you back here when we pull our delicious bread out of the oven. So I know I said I was going to meet you back here when it's time to pull the bread out of the oven, but we're actually going to make the glaze to top our bread first while it's still cooking. So first we're going to add about 1 cup of powdered sugar into this bowl here. This glaze recipe calls for between 1 and 3 tablespoons of milk. Again, I'm out of milk, so I made a 50-50 mixture of heavy cream and water. Again, we're going to gradually add that into this glaze until we get the consistency that we want. So it's a little thick, as you can see here. I wanted to hold off on adding the rest of our milk mixture because even though the recipe does not call for it, I don't know any glaze recipe that would not be improved by a little bit of vanilla extract. So we're going to add a little bit of vanilla extract into this, and then we'll check the consistency after that and see if it needs more milk. This vanilla extract is technically not quite done brewing yet, which is why I have this layer of plastic over it. That way I can shake it and not damage the lid. So we're going to mix this up. And you can really smell the difference that the vanilla extract makes to the final product. I think it just gives it a really nice flavor. This is still a little bit on the thick side. Now, I know that's really personal preference. I'm going to add a little bit more of this milk. Because of the time of year it is here, it is a little bit, the air is a little bit drier. At least today it's a little bit drier. So I'm going to end up using most of that 3 tablespoons. That's really going to depend partly on personal preference, as I said. It's also going to depend on the weather that day, just the individual climate where you are. So this looks about how I like it, just slightly thinner than it was before. I think this will be perfect for topping our bread. We're going to set this to the side until our bread's done baking. So I just pulled our apple fritter bread out of the oven. It looks and it smells amazing. We are going to let this cool a little bit before we add the glaze. If you add the glaze onto a bread right after it comes out of the oven, a lot of times that glaze will really soak into the bread rather than sitting on the top, which, depending on your goal, isn't always a bad thing, but we want our glaze to stay on the top of this bread. So I'm going to let it cool for maybe 15-20 minutes or so, and then we'll go ahead and add our glaze. So I think our bread is cool enough to glaze, so we're just going to drizzle this glaze over the bread just for the perfect finishing touch. So I know you can make this glaze, if you have a little more delicate touch than I do, you can make this glaze look really beautiful. I'm just gonna get it on the bread and it's gonna taste just as delicious. Now I think if you wanted to cut down on the sugar a little bit, I think you could get away with making only half of this glaze recipe. This does seem a little bit extravagant, but it's going to be delicious. And this is something we make for a special treat. This is definitely not our everyday. This is definitely not our everyday eating. Just something to celebrate the fresh apples while they're in season. So I'm going to wait for this bread to cool down a little bit more before giving it a taste. But as you can see, it's beautiful. It smells amazing. I have made this bread several times before and I know that it's delicious, but I will still come back and show you how it looks on the inside once we slice it up. We're back in the kitchen today and we are going to bake the second of our quick breads today. Now this one, it's kind of a toss-up whether you consider it a quick bread or a cake, but either way it is delicious. We are going to be making a really delicious lemon loaf, and if I had to pick, I think this one might be my favorite of all of the breads that we're going to be making together. So I've got my oven preheating to 350 degrees. I've got my loaf pan sprayed with some cooking spray. So let's go ahead and start mixing up our ingredients. So you can see I've got a large mixing bowl here. I'm going to start by adding 3 eggs right into this bowl. So I'm going to measure out 1 cup of sugar and I'm going to add it to our eggs. Now, I do want to mention 1 cup of sugar is quite a bit. This is not necessarily a healthy recipe. It's not something that I would make every day, but it is really delicious. That being said, I do like to slightly undermeasure my sugar for things like this because I don't like things like this to be too sweet. We can't cut down the sugar too much because that will take away from the texture and the body of our bread as well, but you know, I basically just did a scant cup of sugar added right into the eggs. Next, the recipe calls for a cup of either sour cream or Greek yogurt. I prefer to use Greek yogurt, so we're going to go ahead and measure this out. Now, I may not have quite enough in this container, but I do have another container in my fridge. So if this isn't quite enough, we'll grab another one. Now we're going to whisk all these ingredients together. So once I have these ingredients whisked up, which I do now, I'm going to slowly drizzle in half a cup of oil while whisking. Now, the recipe says to use a neutral flavored oil, like a canola oil or a vegetable oil. Specifically says not to use olive oil, but you know, I'm going to be a little bit of a rebel and use olive oil anyway. A lot of recipes like this will caution against using olive oil because it does have a little bit of a stronger flavor compared to something like a canola oil or a vegetable oil. But I really prefer to avoid canola oil and vegetable oil as much as possible. You could certainly use avocado oil. That would probably actually be a closer substitute. But it is kind of expensive. Olive oil is quite a bit cheaper. So because of that, I use olive oil instead. Honestly, it probably does give it a little bit of a stronger flavor, but we really don't mind it, and honestly, I don't even really notice it. So olive oil it is for us. Next, the recipe calls for 2 tablespoons of lemon zest added right into this mixture here. I'm not going to bother measuring. The average lemon, supposedly according to the internet, has about a tablespoon of lemon zest, so I'm just going to zest 2 lemons in here. This might be slightly less because these lemons are a little on the small side, but I think it will be close enough. Now that we've added the zest from these lemons, we're going to go ahead and set them to the side. We will need these later for our glaze, but we don't need any actual lemon juice in our bread. What we do need instead is lemon extract, and this recipe calls for a lot of lemon extract. The recipe calls for between 1 to 2 tablespoons of lemon extract. Most recipes that include an extract you find will call for about a teaspoon or so, but if you want a really intensely flavored lemon loaf, you're going to want to go ahead and add, I usually do pretty close to the full 2 tablespoons. That's going to be a personal preference. But as I said, I like it to be very lemony. Just going to whisk in the lemon zest and the lemon extract. This is about the time when it starts to smell amazing. So I'm going to start with 1.5 cups of flour. The recipe doesn't call for mixing the dry ingredients together separately. I'm not going to do that just because I don't want to get another bowl dirty. But you certainly could do that if you want to make sure that everything gets incorporated. I'm just going to kind of put all my dry ingredients to the side and try to mix them up a little bit before I really whisk to incorporate everything. So I just added 1.5 cups of flour. Next, I am going to need 2 teaspoons of baking powder. I like to sift my baking powder through this little strainer here because I find that occasionally my baking powder has little lumps in it, and you definitely do not want to bite into a clump of unmixed baking powder. And finally, for our dry ingredients, we need to add 1/2 teaspoon of salt. So I'm just going to take my whisk and try to combine the dry ingredients as best I can, and then mix them all together with the wet ingredients. Now, when you're making a recipe like this, it's okay if your batter looks a little lumpy. You just want to get everything combined, but you don't want to worry about getting all the lumps out. If you mix thoroughly until all of the lumps are out, that can create kind of a dense cake or bread, and we obviously don't want that. So a little bit of lumps is fine as long as all the ingredients look moistened. Now we're going to pour this right into our prepared loaf pan. Just going to scrape all this batter out with a silicone spatula. We don't want to miss a single drop of this delicious goodness. Now, as you can see, so far this recipe has come together very easily. I love making quick breads for dessert for this reason. They're so quick and easy, and if you get a good recipe, they're also really delicious. So this one is definitely a winner. Just going to smooth out the top slightly. Doesn't need to be perfect. Our oven's preheated, so we are going to pop this in the oven for between 50 to 52 minutes. I am going to start checking on it at about 45 minutes. While our lemon loaf is cooking, we are going to make the lemon glaze that's going to go on the top of it. For our lemon glaze, we are first going to need 1 cup of powdered sugar. As you can see, I do not have a cup of powdered sugar left. So we are going to put some of my granulated sugar into my blender, and we're going to make our own powdered sugar. Because I just made finely powdered sugar, I am going to wait and let it completely settle because I don't want sugar fumes to go everywhere. Now, when you make your own powdered sugar in the blender, it's not going to be quite as finely powdered as what you get at the grocery store, but it should still work completely fine for most of your baking projects. Now you can see also that this sugar is not pure white. I used I don't know if you can really see the difference here between the white powdered sugar that was in there and the sugar I just added. The sugar that I'm using is my Azure organic cane sugar, which is a little bit less processed, which means it has a little bit of a golden color, making it not pure white. But that actually makes it a higher quality sugar. So I'm happy for that little bit of golden color there. So we're just going to measure out about 1 cup of our freshly ground powdered sugar into this bowl here. So friends, I just measured out the powdered sugar and then realized I forgot to set the timer and I had no idea when I put the bread in the oven. Thankfully, I was recording and I was able to go back through my footage and see what time it was, so I think that our bread is going to turn out okay after all. Now it's time to grab the lemons that we zested earlier, and we are going to juice. I'm going to start with juicing just one of them because we want 3 tablespoons of lemon juice for our glaze. Now, because these lemons are small, I might get 3 tablespoons from 1 lemon. I might not get quite that much, but we'll start with 1 and see what we get. That first lemon was so small that we're going to need to juice the second one too. So just a little tip, if you have a garbage disposal, at least I should say I love to put my used lemons down the garbage disposal because it just really deodorizes it and makes it smell nice and fresh. It's a great way to keep your home smelling a little bit more fresh. Now we're just going to slowly mix our fresh squeezed lemon juice into our sugar here. Once you've got your glaze all mixed up, you can adjust it for texture. If you want it to be thinner or thicker. If you want it to be thinner, add a little more lemon juice, or thicker, add a little more sugar. I also like to give it a little bit of a taste test just to make sure that it's not too sweet, but that it is sweet enough. Now, this is actually a little bit thinner than I like, but since my bread still has 25 minutes left in the oven, and then it's going to have to cool a little bit before we actually put the glaze on it, this glaze may actually thicken up a little bit by the time it's actually ready to use. So I'm going to set this to the side. I'll meet you back here once our bread is out of the oven and it's time to glaze it. So our bread is out of the oven. As you can see, it's nicely browned on top. It's been cooling for about half an hour, so it's time to glaze it. So as I hoped, this glaze thickened up to the consistency that I was hoping while it was sitting here on the counter. Just gonna pour this. As you can see, I'm not being very neat about this. You just want to coat the top of it. Don't really need to be neat or artistic. So our bread is all glazed. Now, this isn't part of the recipe. As you can see, it kind of pools in the corners here. Maybe the glaze wasn't quite as thick as I was hoping for. So probably what I'll do is actually, after it cools a little bit, take my spoon and pick that glaze that's pulled in the corners back up and spread it over the top a little more evenly. But we are going to go ahead and eat dinner. We're going to let this bread finish cooling, and after dinner, I am going to enjoy a delicious slice of this bread, and I will be sure to show you what it looks like. Now, I have made this recipe many times before. I know that it's delicious. This is definitely, if you're only going to try one recipe from this video, this is probably the one. I think this is a family favorite. We're back in the kitchen and it's time to make the third quick bread. Today we're going to be making a cinnamon swirl banana bread. This is one of the recipes that I have not made before, so I'm going to be trying it out today and we'll find out together how it is. I am making it from a website that I have made many recipes from, so I'm guessing it's going to be very good. So I started by preheating my oven to 350. I prepared a loaf pan by spraying it with some cooking spray. The first thing that we're going to do is we're going to mix together the ingredients for our cinnamon swirl, and then we're going to set this aside until we're ready for it. So in my little bowl here, I'm just adding a 1/4 cup of granulated sugar. To our sugar, we want to add 1½ teaspoons of ground cinnamon. That's the same as 1/2 tablespoon. And we're just going to mix this right up. So we've got our cinnamon sugar mixture all ready. We're going to set this to the side. Now let's mix up our dry ingredients. We're going to start with 2 cups of all-purpose flour. right into our mixing bowl here. To our flour, we're going to mix in 1 teaspoon of baking soda, 1/4 teaspoon of salt, and 1/2 teaspoon of ground cinnamon. We're going to whisk together our dry ingredients and set this to the side. And that was our oven preheating to 350. Now I have a stand mixer here that I fitted with a paddle attachment. We're going to start mixing together our wet ingredients in here, starting with our bananas. I have here these 4 ripe bananas. Now, in an ideal world, they'd probably actually be slightly riper than this for banana bread, but I think that this is going to be fine. So the recipe says either 3 large or 4 medium bananas. I'm going to say this is probably medium. So we're going to use 4 bananas in our bread. So in the stand mixer, we are going to cream our butter and sugar. But before we do that, I'm going to add the bananas to here and basically use the stand mixer to mash them up. So we got our bananas all mashed up in here. I'm just going to pour them into this small bowl here, and we're going to set them to the side. Now, this stand mixer bowl is the same bowl that I'm going to cream together the flour and sugar in. We don't even really need to wash it out. If a little bit of banana gets mixed in with the flour and sugar, that's completely fine. They're all going to be mixed together ultimately anyway. To the same bowl in our stand mixer, we're going to add 1/4 cup of butter, which is the same as 1/2 stick of butter. To that butter, we're going to add 2/3 of a cup of granulated sugar. Then we're just going to cream this all together until it's light and fluffy. Now that our butter and sugar is light and fluffy, we are going to add our eggs. We have 2 room temperature eggs here. I want to add them one at a time. So as always, I'm going to crack my eggs individually into a separate container. Now I'm going to go ahead and mix this up until the egg's incorporated, and then we'll add the next one. Now, as always, when you're making a recipe like this in your stand mixer, you want to scrape down the sides regularly just to make sure that everything gets evenly incorporated. And I am now adding 1/3 of a cup of Greek yogurt to my batter, but as you can see, I dropped half of it on my counter. My counter is nice and clean, so I'm just going to scoop this up and add it in. That's what happens when I get talking to you guys and not paying attention to what I'm doing. We also want to add 1 teaspoon of vanilla extract. Then just mix it up. I forgot that I was actually supposed to add the mashed bananas to this along with the yogurt and the vanilla before I mixed it up. As I said, this is the first time I'm making this recipe. So I'm going to add those in and then we'll mix it again. Once all the wet ingredients are combined, we're going to slowly add the dry ingredients to our mixer. So I'm going to add about half, then run this on low speed and then add the rest. Our batter's all mixed up, so I'm just going to scrape as much as I can off of our paddle attachment here because we don't want to waste any of this. Now we want to carefully add about half of this to our loaf pan. Let's say that probably looks like about half. Smooth this out. Then we're going to take our cinnamon sugar mixture and we're going to sprinkle this evenly over the first layer of our bread. Then we're going to take the rest of our dough, or the rest of our batter, I should say. We're going to carefully layer this on top of the cinnamon and sugar. Just going to do my best to spread this out evenly. It's a little bit challenging with that cinnamon mixture in there, but I'm going to do the best that I can. Now the recipe says to take a knife and do a single swirl down the center of the loaf pan. It says to avoid over swirling. We don't want it to be completely incorporated. Our bread is ready to pop in the oven. It's all preheated now to 350 degrees. Now the recipe says to bake this between 55 to 65 minutes. It says to start checking on it every 5 minutes once you reach 55. I'm actually going to start a little bit earlier than that, probably around 50 minutes I'll start checking it. But I'm gonna go ahead and pop this in the oven. Now, just like all the recipes that we are making in this video, this one's a little bit decadent, definitely a dessert bread. So we're going to make a little bit of glaze to go on top of it. I've already added half a cup of powdered sugar to this bowl here, and we're going to go ahead and mix in a tablespoon of milk. We are also going to add a 1/4 teaspoon of vanilla extract, and this is a 1/2 teaspoon, so I slightly overmeasured. That's probably closer to a 1/2 teaspoon than a 1/4 teaspoon, but that will be fine. Just going to whisk up our glaze. And this is really nice, rich vanilla extract. You can see how our glaze has a little bit of a brownish tint to it. Our bread still has quite a ways to go in the oven, so I'm just going to cover up this glaze and set it to the side until our bread is out and cold. I'll meet you back here when we pull our bread out of the oven and we can find out together how well it came out. So our banana bread is out of the oven. It looks and smells delicious. One thing I will say, you can see how it kind of did split open a little bit along, that's basically along the swirl that I made with the knife. So I think if I was to make this again, I think what I would probably do is make the swirl and then smooth the top over it. So this bread is cooled enough that we can glaze it. So we're going to go ahead and drizzle a little bit of glaze on this, and then we will serve this up and enjoy a slice. That looks really good, so let's see how it tastes. So since this is a completely new recipe to me, I haven't tried this before, I figured I should give it a try with you guys, and that way I can let you know how it is. This is really good. It's got really good flavor, nice and moist. That cinnamon swirl definitely takes it to the next level. So this is a winner for sure too. We're back in the kitchen today, and today we're going to be making double chocolate zucchini bread. Now this was perfect timing. I was thinking I was going to have to use some frozen grated zucchini that I saved from earlier this summer, but my garden surprised me with one more fresh zucchini. So this is going to be turned into double chocolate zucchini bread. We're going to start by mixing our dry ingredients in this bowl here. So first, I measured out 1 cup of flour. It's going to go right into the bowl. Next, I'm going to measure out 1/2 cup of cocoa powder. We're going to add 3/4 teaspoon of baking soda. Put that right through my little strainer there. One-quarter teaspoon of baking powder. We're going to add in 1/4 teaspoon of salt. I have some sea salt here. Finally, for our dry ingredients, we are going to need 1/2 teaspoon of instant espresso powder. This isn't enough to give the bread really a coffee flavor. It's just going to enhance the chocolatiness of the bread, and who doesn't want their chocolatey bread to be nice and chocolatey? It does smell delicious while I'm adding it in though. I'm going to whisk these dry ingredients together and set them to the side. And I almost forgot one of the most important ingredients. Now that our dry ingredients are all whisked together, we're going to add in 3/4 cup of chocolate chips. I have here these organic bittersweet chocolate chips because I don't think this bread really needs any more sweetness, but you could certainly use semi-sweet or milk chocolate if you prefer. I've grabbed a second bowl to mix our wet ingredients in. We are going to start by cracking 2 large eggs into the bowl here. To our eggs, we're going to add 1/4 cup of oil. Now, I always say this when I'm baking. I like to use olive oil, even though the recipe usually calls for a more neutral flavored oil, like a vegetable or canola oil. I just prefer the nutrition that you can get in olive oil, and honestly, I know they say that it has a stronger flavor and can change the flavor of your product. We've really never found it to change the flavor in a way that bothered us at all. So 1/4 cup of olive oil, right in with our eggs. Next, we're going to add in 1/3 cup of Greek yogurt. You could definitely use sour cream instead if you don't have Greek yogurt on hand. I prefer Greek yogurt, so we're using that today. To our wet ingredients, we're going to add in 2/3 cup of granulated sugar. And 1 teaspoon of vanilla extract. Whisk it all together. Next, we need to add our grated zucchini. We need 1½ cups of grated zucchini, which we are not going to drain. I think that's about what we'll get from the zucchini here, so let's grate it up and find out. Next, we're going to fold our zucchini in with our wet ingredients. So I've got a 1/2 cup measurer here. So it looks like this is going to be about perfect. Got a little bit extra, so this might be more like 1 3/4 cup. That's going to be fine. So I just realized I misread the ingredients. I was actually supposed to combine the wet and dry ingredients together and then fold in the zucchini. We're going to go ahead and add the wet ingredients, including the zucchini, to our dry ingredients, and I think this bread will still come out fine. All our ingredients combined beautifully, even with my mistake. So I'm going to go ahead and add all this into a 9x5 loaf pan that I've greased with some cooking spray. We're going to add just a few more chocolate chips on the top, just for an extra pretty finish. And then press those gently into the batter. So our bread is ready to bake. Our oven is preheated to 350 degrees. For the size loaf pan that I have, it's going to cook about 45 minutes. The recipe does say to check on it halfway through and cover it with aluminum foil to prevent the top scorching at all. So we're going to check on this in about 20 minutes, cover it with aluminum foil, and then I'm going to check on it again in another 20 minutes after it's been in the oven for 40 minutes to start checking for doneness. I'm going to meet you back here when this is done and show you the final product. We're back in the kitchen today, and it's time to make our final quick bread. This one's going to be a glazed strawberry bread, and this is the second recipe that we're making that is completely new to me. I've never made this before. It looks delicious. I'm really excited about it. Now, I will say, this bread, probably the ideal time of year to make it would be strawberry season, when you have fresh strawberries, either from your yard or fresh local strawberries that you've picked. Right now, it's the end of October, so we do not have fresh strawberries here in Connecticut. So I just picked these up at the grocery store. I will say though, they actually look pretty good for being out of season strawberries. So I'm gonna give this bread a try, and if we really love it, we'll make it again next summer when we have fresh local strawberries. For this recipe, we're going to mix up our dry ingredients and our wet ingredients separately and then combine them. So let's start with the dry ingredients. So into this bowl here, I'm going to start with 2 cups of all-purpose flour. To our flour, we're going to add 1½ teaspoons of baking powder. Just like to sift it to get rid of any lumps. We're going to add 1/4 teaspoon of baking soda and 1/2 teaspoon of salt. Just whisk until the dry ingredients are all combined. I'm going to set aside our dry ingredients, and we are going to turn our attention to this bowl for our wet ingredients. First, we're going to add 1 egg. We're going to add 3/4 cup of granulated sugar, I'm going to do just a little bit less than that to keep our bread a little bit less sweet. And 1/4 cup of brown sugar. The next ingredient is 3/4 cup of buttermilk. I did not have buttermilk on hand, so I made my own by adding a little bit of lemon juice to some milk. So the ratio is, if you're going to make a cup of buttermilk, you want to add a tablespoon of either lemon juice or white vinegar to your measuring receptacle first, and then add enough milk to make it equal 1 cup. Because I was doing 3/4 cup, I kept the ratio the same, but I did about 3/4 tablespoon of lemon juice, and then added enough milk to equal 3/4 cup of buttermilk. And then I let that sit to come to room temperature and just to thicken up a little bit. Now we just want to whisk together our wet ingredients until the brown sugar is completely mixed in and we don't see any lumps from it. So our next ingredient is 1/3 cup of melted coconut oil. So because it says melted coconut oil and not coconut oil melted, I need to measure it and then make sure that it stays at 1/3 cup when it's melted. So what I'm doing here is I'm going to slightly overfill my 1/3 cup, melt it, and remeasure it. Now the beauty of coconut oil is that it melts really quickly and at a really low temperature. So I'm just going to put this in the pan and it should melt really quickly. See, that's already melting. So our coconut oil is all melted. I'm just going to pour that in. And it looks like just about 1/3 cup. I think we measured perfectly. So I'm just going to whisk the melted coconut oil into our mixture, along with 2 teaspoons of vanilla extract. Now before we combine the wet and dry ingredients, I'm going to get our strawberries chopped up and tossed with a little bit of flour. So we want 1½ cups of chopped strawberries. So the reason we want to toss these chopped strawberries with a tablespoon of flour is that it will coat the strawberries and it's supposed to help them stay distributed more evenly throughout the bread rather than just sinking to the bottom. So I'm not sure the exact science behind it, but somehow that coating of flour is supposed to just help the strawberries stay evenly distributed. So it's time to combine all our ingredients. So I'm going to slowly pour the wet ingredients into the dry ingredients. And then I want to go ahead and gently whisk this until there are no lumps remaining, but the recipe does caution not to overmix. In most recipes like this, overmixing can cause the final bread to be a little bit tough. So we obviously don't want that. We want it to be nice and fluffy and delicious. So we're going to whisk just long enough to eliminate the lumps. All right, so this looks good and smooth to me. So we are going to stop mixing here. I'm going to add the strawberries and then gently fold them in with my rubber spatula. Now that the strawberries are all combined, I'm just going to go ahead and pour our cake batter into this loaf pan that I've already sprayed with cooking spray. Our bread is all ready to go into the oven. I have my oven preheated to 350 degrees. Now, this is a 9x5 loaf pan here. The recipe actually calls for an 8x4, which I don't have. So we're going to use the larger size. I think it'll be fine, but we probably will have to take it out of the oven a little bit sooner. So the recipe says bake for between 55 to 70 minutes. It also says halfway through baking to cover it with aluminum foil to prevent the top from getting too brown. So I am going to start checking on my bread at about 45 minutes. It probably won't be done yet. So what I'm going to do is set my timer for 25 minutes. Then we're going to cover the top with aluminum foil. Then I'll meet you back here when it's time to pull the bread out of the oven. So here is our strawberry bread out of the oven. It looks and smells delicious. It is mostly cooled off now, So we're just going to go ahead and make a really quick glaze and glaze this just like we've made for a lot of our other breads this video. So as I'm sure you could tell by seeing all the times we've made a really similar glaze, this basic vanilla icing it's basically just a go-to classic glaze just to take any dessert recipe just up a little bit more. So I added half a cup of powdered sugar to this bowl here, and you can use milk. This recipe actually recommends heavy cream to make the glaze a little bit thicker. So we're adding a tablespoon of heavy cream right into our milk, or right into our sugar, I should say. We're also going to add in about a 1/4 teaspoon of vanilla extract and mix that up. So as I said, this is a really easy go-to glaze or icing recipe, and depending on what dessert you're making it to go with, you could definitely customize it by replacing the vanilla extract with, say, peppermint extract, orange extract, lemon extract. Anything like that would make it, obviously change the flavor and make it really versatile. So I'm going to show you, this glaze is really thick. This is a lot thicker than the other glazes that we've made. I think definitely because it used heavy cream. I actually don't remember the exact proportion in the other recipes. It's possible that they used slightly more liquid as well. So we're going to drizzle this over the top of our bread. So this is actually coming out a little clumpier than I want. I think I'm going to add a little bit more liquid. We'll just add a tiny splash more cream to this. So I thinned this out a little bit. Let's see if this looks, you know, honestly, if we really wanted to drizzle it, I think we should probably thin it out a little bit more. You know what I'm gonna do? I'm just going to abandon the idea of making this pretty, and I'm just going to spread it over the top evenly instead. Yeah. So there it is, all finished. Definitely less pretty than if we had been able to drizzle it, but it will still taste just as good. So because this is a new recipe that we haven't tried before, I'm gonna meet you back here after we try it, and I'm going to let you know how we liked it. We're gonna eat this as a family tonight after dinner, so I'll be sure to meet you back here and let you know exactly how we liked it. So the strawberry bread is definitely another winner. So all 5 of the breads in this video were really delicious. So my family, I think, is kind of torn between the favorite bread being the lemon loaf and the apple fritter bread. Those are our 2 favorites. But honestly, all 5 of these breads are really delicious. So I definitely encourage you to make whatever one sounds good to you. I am going to go ahead and link all of the recipes in the video description. So any of these breads that you want to try, you can find the recipe there. So thank you so much for hanging out with me in my kitchen over the last couple weeks. I really enjoyed making all these delicious breads with you. We made some tried and true favorites, and I got to try out 2 new recipes too, so that was a lot of fun. So I definitely hope that you come back and hang out with me again. We've got lots of exciting adventures planned coming up over the next couple months. So thank you so much for joining me today. I hope you're having a great day, and I can't wait to see you soon. I'll see you next time.